Hello everyone. Any questions before we start? Okay. So today it's going to be our fifth lab, and we start talking about graphical user interfaces. And we already in the previous lab talked about how to use Python to execute some SQL queries, to retrieve some data from our database, and at the same time we are able to, for example, insert some new entries to our tables through Python code. But doing that is going to require you to know some coding in Python. And we would like to this time create some application for the average user to be able to use it. So today, if you go to the lab homepage, today's material is this Jupyter notebook file, and there is also the simple Python version of it. And let me also remind you that starting from lab number 4, for these 3 labs, we actually have some Python code, and we have 2 versions of it. The recommended one is actually the Jupyter notebook, because in the lab it is better to be able to focus on different cells and, like, for example, run the individual code. But the PY version, this simple Python versions, are exactly the same code, but they are not designed to be run as a whole. So this is a Python code, a whole code, but actually you should, if you are using this code, you should focus on singular cells and like execute one block of it. So in here you will see that the blocks are represented as like in, then some number follows that, and between these 2 parts it is the code that you need to focus at a time. Otherwise, if you run the whole code, maybe you might get some errors, or because we have some loops at different parts for our programs, so it will be within that loop and it will expect some input, then you will be able to interact with through the command line, for example, and then you can still run it. So today we have this lab 5 Jupyter notebook file, but you also need to include the lab 3 database file in the same folder, because actually we are using that database file as well. So by the way, the project implementation stage 1 is also assigned on Moodle. So let me also remind this one. It is the deadline is for next week. Actually, what you need to do for this stage is very simple. You just need to create the database file that you are going to work in the next stages. And to do that, we want you to use SQL Studio. This was the topic of lab number 2. So in lab number 2, we created the tables. We, for example, set the foreign keys, the primary keys of the tables, and that's what we expect you to do in this stage of the project. You just need to follow the relational schema that you created. Actually, in the relational schema, the information about what tables you need to create, what are the attributes, what are the foreign keys, what are the primary keys, every information is there. You just need to translate that knowledge to SQL Studio into a database using SQL Studio. And you need to just upload that database file. Any questions or problems about this so far? So let's start today's topic then. So I actually downloaded the Jupyter notebook file for lab number 5, and I also have this SQL database from lab 3. So we are going to look at that code. And if you missed the last lab, I also recommend you to look at the recording, because in there we start using Python to interact with the database, and for that we were using SQL3 library. And in there we also have like some handout if you have some problem installing Python. Any version of Python is fine for us. hopefully you got the Python class before this course and you already know how to use Python. For example, Spider, using Spider is okay for us. There is no problem with that. But I will be using the Jupyter Notebook because it is easier during the lab to focus on individual cells. And this one is, for example, a markdown cell. We had like cells that contain code. We can execute the code in them. And for some cells, for example, if I double click on this cell, it is a markdown cell, so we can use some special marks here to include some style. And whenever we try to run such a cell, it is going to apply that style. So the difference between those cells are so under the cell option, you have the cell type. So in any of the cells, you can convert the type. So the first one is actually a markdown cell. And we are going to require the PySimple GUI library. So it's an external library. We need to install it to our Python. And if you are using, for example, Anaconda distribution, there are several ways of installing this library if it is not already installed on your system. One option is to go to PowerShell. So if you start typing Anaconda, you will see that there is the Anaconda PowerShell prompt. If you open that up, you can access the prompt line. So from this command line, I can execute some code. One of them is like pip install command. So if I write pip install PySimple GUI, then this is going to install and set up the right library. But it is already installed on my computer, so it is not going to do anything. But this is like one way of doing it. After I download and install this library, I may need to restart or reopen Jupyter Notebook. One other alternative, I can run this cell. So in this cell, I have this exclamation mark, meaning that I'm not executing actually Python code. I need to access the command line. So if I execute this code line, let me do that actually, it is going to execute this command in the command line, but it is going to do the same. It's going to say that requirement is already satisfied. It's already installed in my Python. So other than that, we have some additional links here as well. So the library that we are going to introduce is for creating user interfaces, and it's a general library. It's not focused on any database applications, but we are going to use it for database applications. So if I open these up, so these are actually like the whole reference. For example, if you need like to know any detail of these libraries, any detail of the items that we can use in the graphical user interface, this is going to be the page to go. So it's actually very long, and it has some good examples if you need to apply some styling, etc. There are like lots of different examples of it, and we are going to only cover a small portion of it, but it will be enough for your project. So in the project, most of the time you need to get some input from the user, and then with that input you are going to operate on the database, and then you would like to give some information to the user. Maybe you are going to project some data, etc. And the items that we are going to introduce today is going to be actually enough for everything that we need to do for the project. And if, for example, any of the items, for example, we will have some buttons. And for a button, there is actually lots of different options. For example, you might enable or disable a button at different times. You can change the size of it. You can like apply some hotkeys to, for example, whenever I press on a key on my keyboard, it is going to actually press on that button, etc. So if you need additional detail, it is there in the reference. So these last two are for the markdown cells in Jupyter Notebook. They are just for information. You don't actually need to know anything about applying markdown in Jupyter Notebook, but this is like just a way to include some information to the coder or the designer within the notebook file. So after you install that library, we are going to have some examples, and we are going to import it from PySimple GUI, and I'm going to give the name SG to the object that I retrieve. So most of the time, with a user interface, we would like to have some elements for the user to interact. So the user interface, why it's there? Because we would like to interact with the user in an easier way. We could have done everything in command line, but using command line applications are not that simple, right? We need to remember some codes, some keywords, etc. And while you are showing information to the user, it's not always very nice looking, etc. So we are going to actually create some graphical user interface to interact with the user. And in PySimple GUI, we create actually windows. So to interact with the user, the container that we are going to use is called a window. And within a window, we need to put some layout. So window is just a container. We need to have some layout in that window, and not just an empty layout, we need to put some elements. So we are going to actually introduce a bunch of elements that we can include in our layout. And this is like a very basic one. So the item tags, so for each of these elements that we put into our layout, they are coming from the library directly. So I named SG, so PySimple GUI. SG.text is for giving or showing information to the user. These are actually like static items to show some text to the user. We will use the input elements, and input elements are designed to get text input from the user. So with sg.input, we actually put some element there to retrieve input from the user. Since we need to retrieve some information, we actually need to give a name to these items. So with the text items, it accepts one parameter, and that parameter is what's written inside that text element. But with input elements, actually we are not going to put the text in there because we expect the user to write something there. Instead, we assign some key to these items. So from any element, if we are going to retrieve some information, or if we are going to get some data from the user, we need to give a key to that item. And the key is also going to be a string. And like if it is easy to remember for you, it's better. So let's say in here, I expect the name of the user from this input item. So I name the key as name underscore input. Any string is fine there. We also most of the time use buttons, and buttons are to trigger some functionality. So we put a button there, and the user can click on that button. Whenever we click on that button, so there is the name of this button, send is the name of this button. Whenever we click on that button, it's going to actually trigger some functionality. So it's going to go to our loop, and in there we are going to catch that event. So we are going to look at those in a minute. But first we need to create the layout, and layout is actually a list of items. So because of these square brackets, I know that this is a list of items. And in here as well, I also include second level square brackets. They are for going to the next lines. So in a minute, I'm going to let me actually first execute this code to see what it is doing. So I'm going to run this cell, and it's going to open up a window. And in this window, we have the text, right? Name and surname. These are text elements. These are static elements. I'm not able to click on them. I cannot alter them as a user directly. But I have some input elements here, two of them, and I can click on these input elements. I can type something into these input elements. So I can also like have some space characters in it. I can delete, modify the text that I write there. So another thing, I have the buttons, the send and exit button, and if I click on the send button, it is actually going to print what have I written into the input elements. So we are going to see why it is printing that, but if I click on the exit button, then it's also going to close that window. So that's actually our layout. So the square brackets mean that every item that I put is going to appear on a separate line. For example, in here, if I would like to put the name and the input for the name on the same line, I'm going to just get rid of the square brackets that is between those items. So in this second level square bracket, there is the text item, comma, there is the input item. So in here as well, if I get rid of the square brackets and if I put the comma directly, then the surname and this input area for the surname is going to appear on the same line. So these are for designing the user interface. So anything actually, these are not because they are on separate lines in my Python code. They are on the same line, for example, or if I put them on different lines as well, they are going to appear on the same line as long as they are contained within this same square bracket. So that's actually what I'm trying to say. If you need to like apply some better or different design, you need to contain them within square brackets. But just a layout is not enough. We also need to create a window for that layout. So the window is the window that we have in our system, and we need also a title for the window. So if you realize, my first window is written as the title of this window. It's again static, the user cannot change it directly, but we need to give the layout to the window. Otherwise, in here, if we are not passing the layout, it's not going to create the thing that we want. So this is like a blueprint of our design, and we are actually sending it to the window, and once it is given to the window, we cannot actually change the layout directly. We need to like access the window, etc. We are going to see examples of it, but we are going to have a main loop of our program. So this is going to be actually our main loop for the program, and in there we basically have a while loop, and the condition can be like defined in a different way, but most of the time we say while true, and then when we need to get out of the loop of the program, we can just go there and like break out of the loop. So in here, for example, whenever we click on the close button or the exit button, we are breaking out of that loop. And at the end, we need to also call the close function for a window. Otherwise, the window is not closing by itself. So this is going to be applied with the function. So coming back to our loop, in our program loop, we need to read some information from the window. And that information is grouped as events and values. So within the event parameter or the variable, let's say, within the event variable, we get the names of the buttons that user clicks. And within the values, we are retrieving the user inputs for the keyed items. So if you remember here, for some of the items we have keys, right? So for this input element, there is key. For this other input element, there is some other key. For any keyed item, whenever we read the information from the window, it is contained in the values list. So as an example, to see what we are getting for these two elements, I'm printing event and values. So I'm going to show the outputs. So let me run this cell. So this is the cell running. There is no output yet. So in here, I'm going to first click on the send button. So this first line is actually printing what I have here. So this print is printing the event and the values. So if I click on send, it is going to show two more lines of output, but right now I'm just looking at this first line of output. Actually, it might be better if I put them on separate lines. Let me actually do that. So it is going to print the event, and it is also going to print the values on separate lines. So let me just click on the send button. I see that the first one, the event, is called send. Actually, we are not talking about multiple events at the same time, because the user is going to click on a button, one button at a time. So the user is not able to click multiple buttons at the same time. Because of that, we just call it event. There is just one event, and the event name is send, the name of the button that user clicks on. If you look at that second line, this is the values, and the values is a list of items. There can be multiple things in it, and this is actually like a dictionary, right? We have the key of it, name input, and the corresponding value for it, which is empty string. For the surname input as well, we have the empty string. So let me, for example, for the name, if I write something here, if I click on the send button, this time for the output, I see that for the name input, I have Sinan there. And for example, if I put the surname as well, it is going to contain that value for the surname inputs here. Any questions or problems so far? So this is a string. It can also like contain empty spaces. Whenever I click on the send button, I'm going to see that it is contained in my values. So this is going to be like how we operate basically, or how we interact with the user. Let me also click on the exit button. If I click on the exit button, you will see that there is the exit event that we print, but the values are still there. So remember, whenever I click on the exit, I'm not actually directly closing the program. I'm actually just breaking out of the loop, and the thing that closes my program is this line, window.close. So going back, so let's remove or comment these lines that print our events and values. At each stage of the program, you can think it like that, we are reading input from the user. Actually, whenever user clicks on some button, we are reading this information. Otherwise, the information is not read. We are just waiting for some input from the user. And like writing something here, it is not causing the window.read function to return. So right now, window.read function is waiting, but it is waiting for some button trigger. So whenever I click on a button, then the window.read returns, and it is going to do some other functionality. So that functionality, what we are doing is actually we are looking at the event. So most of the time we will have a bunch of buttons, and those buttons are going to have different names or different text on them. And since whenever I click on a button, the event is the same thing that's written on that button. For example, if the event is equal to the string send, then I'm going to do these two lines. And that's actually just printing the name and the surname of the user. So remember, we got the values from this window.read function. And to print the values individually, we need to use their keys. So I'm not going to use the whole dictionary. I'm just going to retrieve some individual values from them. And remember, these keys are the keys that we give while creating the layout. So name underscore input. I expect the name of the user inside this input area. And to retrieve that information, I'm going to say values within the square brackets, the key of the input area, which is name underscore input. Again, for the surname, this time values surname input. So those are going to actually print out the values on different lines. So most of the time, if you like encounter any problems, just check the values, whether they are correct or not, whether you are using the correct keys. So you should be careful about those. And for the exit event, what we are doing is actually we are here just catching that event. So we have an exit button as a button, right? If we click on that button, the event is going to be equal to exit. So if I click on exit, the event is equal to exit. I break out of the loop and I close the program. So let me open the events part for now. If I click on the exits, it is going to print that event. But there is also one other way of closing a window, which is this close window symbol. If I click on there, then the event is going to be none. So that's just one difference. So if the event, if we click on the close button on the cross mark in the window, then the event is not called exit, it is called none, which is this constant stands for sg.win underscore closed. This is for whenever you close the program through the exit button, the native symbol of the operating system. So that's just one simple difference. Any questions or problems? So now let's see some example for navigation. So most of the time, instead of just one window, we are going to have a bunch of windows, and we need to be able to navigate in between those different windows. So let me first actually run this code to show the example. So this is saying this is the main window. We have a bunch of buttons here. If I click on go to window 1, for example, it's going to this time open window number 1. And these are the options that we have here. For example, maybe I'm first logging in as a user. I have a bunch of options. Maybe I would like to enroll to some classes. I would like to see my grades, etc. For different tasks, we require different windows. If everything is on just one window, it's not that user friendly. And in the project, we ask for some user friendly programs, right? If everything is hard, it's no good for us. So we have the option to go back to the main menu. For example, in your projects as well, we expect such navigation. We would like to be able to go back to the main menu and from there go into some other option, etc. And for example, whenever we want to exit, we are also able to exit our program. So let's look at the code for this. So for the first window that we have, this is the layout. And in this layout, we have some text saying that this is the main window. And we have our two buttons, go to window 1, go to window 2, and the exit button. So actually, to put an exit button, we are in here using the sg.exit function as well. So on top of any normal button, you can write exit, that's one option, and sg.exit is actually doing the same thing for you. So that's one thing that you can use. We are creating the window, and once you create the window, it opens up, and then we have our while loop, right? So let me actually do something for now. Let me just copy this part of the code and show what happens if you don't have any loop and if you don't have any window close line. So if I run the cell, will it not do anything? Let me check. Okay, it's actually without a loop, maybe it's not open it up. So one thing, if there is the window close function there, it's going to open the window and immediately close it. And okay, let me put the loop and just read the events there, and there is no, let's say, way of going out of this loop. And without, we are catching events. So catching events means that we are checking the event, and if it is equal to some value, we are doing some operations. Without it, these buttons do nothing. Okay, so that's one thing to know. Even the exit button, the function is not attached to it. We are just triggering events, and looking at those events, we need to decide through the code what to do. So that's one thing to notice. If I click on the close button, so it's going to give some error message because I'm not catching that event as well. So actually it says you tried 100 times to read a close window, etc. So maybe because of the loop, maybe we got the problem. But the thing that I would like to mention is that sometimes it is going to crash. And when it crashes, the window and the code or the kernel running for Python codes are kind of different. So you might crash the window, then you need to still stop the kernel. So in here, I might need to stop it from running. So it might also cause this window to not close. So you might need to, like, it is going to say it's not responding, etc. You might need to close it from the operating system when you have some mistakes in the code. So that's one thing to notice. So for example, it says kernel restarting. It is going to restart automatically because it stopped because of a problem. So just be careful about that. You might need to, like, force it to close separately. So the Python code and the window, they are kind of like two different things, because the library is actually using some native code for creating the window, etc. But if you have the correct code, there's going to be no problems. So let's look at this code again. So we are creating the window. We have our main loop for the program. At each stage, so this is going to be some basic thing that we are going to do. We read the events and values. Then we are going to look at which button the user clicks on. This could happen from any of our windows. So for example, at the start, we start from here, from our main window. And in our main window, we have go to window 1, go to window 2. But in some other window as well. So this is the main window. I have the option to go to 1 or 2. If I go to 1, there is also the option to go to window 2. So if I need different functionality for the same button name, then I need to also keep track of the window that I'm currently in. So that's going to be like one important thing about this. So if I need to be aware of the window, then I need to somehow keep that information as well. So for example, whenever I click on the go to window 1 button, I should set some variable. But in this program, go to window 2 is going to do the same thing in which window we are in. It is going to not make a difference. Whether we are in the main window or window 1, go to window 2 is going to do the same operation. Because of that, in here we are just looking at the event. Otherwise, we might need to keep some other variable as well and check the value of it. But in here, whenever I click on go to window 1 button, I need to do two things. I first need to close the current window. So window.close is going to do that. So I'm going to close the current window. Then I need to set up some new window. But for that new window, I'm going to use a different layout. So I create the layout 1. This time this is for window 1. We have different buttons there, etc. Then I need to create that window. So if you look, these two lines or these two part blocks are very similar to what we have done initially. So these two things. We have a layout and we construct that layout within a window. We have some other layout because the layout, when you create the layout, you cannot modify it directly through the variable. If you are using the same names, so let me show it actually. If in here as well, so let me close it. Actually, let's do this layout as well. If I click on go to window 1, okay, it actually runs then. Huh? Let me go back to main. Okay, there is no problem. So here you can use the same name. The problem is, I guess, if you are trying to use the exact same layout. So if this is a command here, and whenever I construct a new window here, if I'm using the existing layouts, then this is going to cause a problem. So if I click on this, this is going to cause a problem because if a layout is already in use, I cannot create a new window using the same layout. So that's just one thing that we need to be careful about. So now it crashed. I need to stop the kernel and I need to like close this other window separately. I might need to like force it to close, etc. So sometimes if it is not responding, so you might need to go to kernel and like you can choose the restart or interrupt options there. So I'm going to restart the kernel. If the kernel is gone, then the window is also gone. So let me fix the change here. So for this, I have a different layout, and whenever we click on Go to Window 2 button, it's going to create a different layout. It's going to create a different window using that layout. And if we click on the Go to Main or Back to Main button, whatever window we have currently, we are going to close it, and we are going to have some other layout. This is our original layout. So initially we were constructing the same layout, but this time we are doing it whenever the event is back to main. So that's actually very simple. Any questions or problems so far? So most of the time we are going to require lots of different windows, and because of that, having some functions to create specific windows is going to be a good idea. So in the cell, this is actually, if I run it, let me actually run it. This is the same thing. It is actually doing the exactly same thing, but the code looks nicer because we have functions for individual windows. So this is for window main, window 1 and window 2. And what I'm doing, for each function, I define the layout and then I return the window. I construct and return the window. Why I need to return the window? Because at the end I need to close the current window, or whenever I need to go to a different window, I need to like close the current window and then create a new window. So these first lines are for defining our functions, and initially what I'm doing is for this window variable, I'm just calling wMain function. I don't need any parameters, etc. And that function is going to return a handle or a pointer to the window that we construct. And within our while loop, again, we read the event and values, and we check our events. And within here, based on the button that we click, we just close the current window and construct a new window using the functions. So that's doing the exactly same thing, but if you separate the parts that create the windows into different functions, it will be easier to use. So we can keep variables to use in different windows. So for example, in here, let me actually first run the code. It says, welcome, please enter your name. So I have some input here. If I write the name and click on the enter, then if you notice here, we are displaying the username. I have another inputs area here. We are able to update existing items. So in here, for example, if I write Ali, if I click on update name, I just change the name that exists on that item. So let's see how to do that. So we define two functions. So the first one is for the introductory window. So it says, welcome, please enter your name. For this input, we have the key in underscore name. We have this enter button. We have this exit button. We create the window for it. And this is for the other window. We have this time for this function, we receive some username parameter. And within our layout, while creating the layout, we also pass the username to this text item. So if you remember, for sg.text, we can write a string here. So this expects a string, right? Just a single string is also fine. We can append existing strings, right? Username input for this function is also expected to be a string. We just append two strings for our layout. In here we have like another text saying new name. Maybe I should have a column here. Enter your new name here. We have another input element. This time the key is update underscore name. We could have used the same key as well because these are different windows. So if you are operating on different windows, you can use the same key names. So the key names are like unique. It should be unique within a window, but within different windows they can be the same name. We have the update name button, we have the exit button there, and we are actually keeping the username as a variable in our Python code. So the username is also within the input elements, right? The user is going to write the username there as an input. We are going to get the username, and we would like to keep that username while we are running the program. So in different windows, we might want to display that username. So for that, we need to keep it as a parameter, right? And initially, we construct our W name window. This is the first window that we have. And our program loop here, we read event and values at each trigger of a button. Then we look at the event. So the enter event, let's look. The enter event is whenever the user clicks on the first button. So we have the welcome page. Please write your name, it says. We have the area to write the name, and whenever we click on that button, we are doing these things. Within the values, so remember this is a dictionary. Within that dictionary, we have the in underscore name key. So this is the input that we are looking at. So if you have a typo there, etc., it is not going to retrieve that information. You will have like empty text. But in this case, this is in underscore name. We read the user's name from there. We put it into our variable. We close the current window. And this time we open the second window. It's called wshowInfo. So this window. And remember, this window expects a parameter, the username. We just pass the username to that function. So it is going to create a window that also includes the username of the user that enters our program. Another option to change the username is whenever we click on the update name button. And update name button, if you remember, is within this second window. In that second window, we are saying hello username, and then if you want to write some other name, there is the text area for that. We retrieve the input with the key update underscore name, and whenever we click on the update name button, we are going to cache this event. We retrieve the new username. This time from the values we get the update underscore name. So this is our key. We are going to retrieve that value. We are going to close this current window, which is actually the same window we are creating again. So sometimes, there are actually two options to make a modification in the current window. One option, you can close the current window and open it again. So in here we are using that option. We are closing the current window, and actually we are with the new username constructing the same window. Another option, we can get some values from the current window and make some updates. We are going to see examples of it later on. But if we click on the exit button, we also close our program. So let's run it again. For example, it says please enter your name. I can write the name, click on the enter button, and in here the name shows up. But if I want to change the name, I can write a different value, or if it is empty, empty string is also a valid string. So if it is empty, it's not going to give any errors. But if you want to check whether it is empty or not, you can use some additional Python code. So for example, you can check something if it is numeric or not, etc. So those will help for a more user-friendly program. So now we are going to actually look at the Listbox element. Most of the time in our programs, we would like to show some information to the user, right? And to do that, we have seen so far the text element. It can contain a static text. You can give information about what to write into an input element. But if you are going to have a list of items, for example, in our database, we have a bunch of users. And if the user is going to choose among the existing users, we need to include some elements to list the items. So for that, we have the list box. Let me actually first run this cell as well. We have the list box, a bunch of names here. I'm able to choose one of them. If I click on the OK, I can also retrieve information about which elements in the list box the user chooses. So for example, let me close it and run it again. If I click on OK, I can also know whenever the user chooses nothing there. So that element is actually fairly simple. So sg.listbox, this is our function. It expects a list of items or a tuple of items. It is going to contain those items within. We also define a size for it. It can be omitted, so let me actually get rid of the size parameter, and let's also get rid of the key parameter for now. I'm just creating a new list box, let's say, and instead of writing the choices directly, I can write them directly here. So these are my 3 choices. Let me run it. It's going to contain my list box, but the size actually fits the length of the items that I have inside. So for example, if these are such things, let me run it. So for the first line it fits, but then for the other ones it is going to keep the same size. For example, if some of them are longer, it is actually, I guess, it is going to fit for the widest of them. But most of the time for a list box, it is better to give the size exactly. For those, for the other items as well, I can give the size. So let me go back. So I can pass the choices. I'm defining this tuple in a different line. I can pass them as a parameter. It's going to have my list box here. Let me go one more back. The key is actually used whenever I need to retrieve some value. So if you remember, for the inputs, for the text input areas, we were using a key because we would like to get some information from the user. That's why we here as well have a key. And we define a size. Size expects 2 parameters. For example, it could be like 30 to 30. It's going to be containing 30 characters width, and the height is going to be for 30 different items. we don't have such a long list. The line count can be like something like 5 here, and the length is actually the width. It is going to be the number of choices. So for example, this is the first one is the width, so let's make the width 10, and this is the number of lines that we have. If you make it length of choices, then it is going to like fully contain the list of items we have, and if I include some other choices as well, they will be also covered in my list box. So if you don't have any questions, let's give a 10 minutes break now, and then we will continue at 4:30. If you have any questions, you can ask them. Otherwise, let's give a 10 minutes break. Okay, any questions or problems before we start? So currently we need to do the implementation stage 1 for the project. So these are like some reminders before we start. So for the implementation stage 1, what you need to do, you just need to follow the relational schema that you wrote before. So design stage 2 was for writing the relational schema. You write the descriptions for your tables, the attributes, the primary and foreign keys, you just wrote them. You got the feedback, most of you got the majority correct. So there was just one slight problem in one group's relational schema. You are going to this time convert them into a SQL database, and for that you are free to use any software. You can just do it using Python directly. But in lab 2 we saw how to use SQL Studio, and like the recommended one will be to use the software, but using any software you can create this database file, the SQL database file with the DB extension, and you are going to upload it until Friday next week. And today in lab we are actually looking at how to use PySimple GUI library to create user interfaces, and we are also going to use some SQL database as well. The previous lab was about how to connect to the database, how to execute on some SQL queries, how to retrieve the entries, and how to print them on the console on the command line. But this time we are creating the user interface, and first we are looking at some steps. So we have seen the text elements for giving information to the user. We have seen the input elements for retrieving string or text input from the user. We have buttons. So the functionality, the most functionality, we do it through buttons, and we have the text written on the button. Whenever that button is clicked, we retrieve that as an event, and then according to the event that we get, we are going to have some if-else statements and decide on the functionality that we need to do. And by functionality I mean having some Python code that's going to do different things. We had the exit function as well as an element, and this time we are talking about the listbox element. And listbox element can contain a bunch of items, so this is given as a tuple here, but I think it can be also a list. So let me actually try that first before saying that that's possible. Yeah, that's also possible. Whether a list or a tuple, it gets like multiple items, and it is going to show those multiple items. But you need to be careful about one thing. So this list box is actually created whenever we run the layout. So while creating the list box, we pass these choices. So these are our choices given as a list. But in our code at some place else, if we modify the list choice, if we modify this list, it is not going to directly affect our list box. So the choices variable, which is a list now, is something different than our list box. So that's just one thing you need to be careful. If I modify the choices list, it is not going to affect my list box. I need to still update my list box using the function. We are going to see an example of it. But because of that, it is better to think the input of a list box as a tuple, because tuples are not modifiable. So we don't expect to modify a tuple in Python code. So let's look at our main loop for the program. Again, we read the events and values. We are printing the values to see how they appear. So if you remember, in this layout, our single values is going to be this list box, right? We retrieve the key or we get the values from the items that contain a key. And listbox, this listbox is the single item that we have in our layout. And because of that, when we print the values, it's going to contain what the listbox has. So let me run it and let's look at the output of our program. If I click on OK directly, I see that for chosen name, I have an empty list. And if I choose any of the items, it's going to contain the value that I choose, but it is going to contain it in a list. So this is something important. The return output that I get from a list box is a list. Because of that, I need to make some indexing if I need to get the first index, for example. This is designed like that because I can use some different setting, and from this list box I can actually choose multiple items. By default, it doesn't allow me to do. By default, I can only choose one item, but there is the possibility to be able to choose multiple items. And because of that, the value that I get from the list box is actually a list. It is an empty list if nothing is selected, and it is going to contain a single value if I choose one thing, because by default it only allows me to choose one value. So if I look at here, I was printing the values, and if I look at the event, if it is the OK event, so the OK button that I have there, I'm going to check whether something is selected or not, whether it is empty or not. So from the values, if you remember, I have just one key, which is chosen name. If I get that, and if it is empty, I'm going into the else part. I'm going into this part. If it is not if it is not empty, I'm doing this line of code. If it is empty, I'm doing the other line. And to give some immediate information to the user, the pop-up function is very useful. With sg.popup, we just display one message to the user, and there is the close button. So for example, let me actually create some other cell here, and in here, let's say I have sg.popup, and within that I can write any message. So let's say this is my message. So if I run that cell or that function, it is going to create a single dialog or a window with my message in it, and there is the OK button to close that window. So this is very useful to give error or success messages to the user. For example, while trying to log in, you are going to say, okay, your password is wrong, maybe there is no such user, etc. For giving such information, the pop-up windows are very useful. So going back to our code, we check whether this chosen name key, which is the output that we get for our list box, if it is not empty, so if this contains something, we create a pop-up and it says you have chosen, and then it displays the chosen name. But remember, this was a list. I need to do the indexing to get the string. So otherwise, this is a list of items, a list of string. I'm not able to append a string with a list of string. So it might give an error. So actually, in here, if I don't say index 0, it's going to give an error, and it will say that, okay, can only concatenate string with string, not with a list. So that's going to be the problem in there. So let me interrupt the kernel and close this window. So if we are dealing with list boxes, just remember you need to use the indexing, and most of the time for our project it will be enough. We are not going to choose multiple items from a list box, and because of that, for the output of a list box, we are going to always get the item in index 0. If nothing is selected, we again display a different pop-up window and it says you did not choose anything. So let's look at some very similar item. It is called a combo, but combo is designed to show a single row at a time, but still the user is able to list a bunch of items for a combo and can choose some other line of the combo. But the difference is that for a combo, there can be only one value selected at a time. So let me run it first to show what it does. So we again have a similar setup. We can click on OK. It says you did not choose anything. If I click on this triangle symbol, I can choose one of the existing items. So I again know which line is selected. If I choose Mary, it says you have chosen Mary, etc. One single difference, this is also an input area. You can enable or disable this. So receiving keyboard input, it is enabled by default, but you can disable it if you need to. But in the project you don't have to, but just be careful. I can also type some different information here, but from the looks of it, it looks like I need to choose an item, not type. But in the project, that's okay if it is still receiving the keyboard input. So let me close it and let's look at the code that we use for the combo. It's very similar with just one single difference. So instead of listbox, we write combo here. Again, we gave the tuples, we defined the size of it, we have a key for it. Coming back to our main loop, for this values that we get, we look at the event. If it is the OK one, if we chose something, meaning that if this is not empty, so let me actually show the output. This time chosen name is not a list, it is a string. So that's the single difference for a combo. So for a list box, it is returning a list. For a combo, it is returning the string directly. And because of that, I don't need to make any indexing. So let me come back to here, in here. So I get the values from this combo, whose key is chosen underscore name. I get that value and I can concatenate the string directly. It is not a list. If nothing is selected, I display nothing is selected message. So in this code, I also have those like information. So we don't have the zero indexing in this one. So this time we would like to do some examples using these items. So these items are actually enough for the user interface that we need for the project. We need to combine different things. So in the previous lab, we used SQLit3 library to interact with our database. And today we started looking at PySimple GUI. This is for interacting with the user. So these are like two bridges. So the user is here. Through the user interface, it interacts with our Python code. And in our Python code, we need a library to access our database portion. We are going to run some SQL queries, etc. So this is from this previous lab. We need to connect to a database. And remember, in SQLit3 library, the connect function receives the name of the library. If this is an existing library in the path of the project, it is going to import that library, import that database. It is going to open that database. If it does not exist, it is going to create that database. So maybe if you are getting some error about like that table does not exist, as etc. So let's say I'm trying to project the users from my database, and if I'm getting some messages saying there is no such table as user table, for example, then the problem could be that I do not include my original database, and because of that, this line of code is going to actually create a new database. because using the SQL library, I can also use some SQL code to create tables. And because of that, this connect function is both used for importing the existing databases and also for creating a new database. So because of that, in my folder, so I need to make sure that this lab3.db already exists. So this is the existing database. It has like non-zero size. From there, I can understand that it's not just created using this code. And if you remember, we were keeping a cursor to our connection. In this example, we are going to, let's actually run this example. We are going to list our users, list our companies, and we would like to be able to assign a user to a company as a partner. So if I click on here, I have the list of users that I have, and these information are coming from the database. These are not hard-coded through Python. So let me choose one of them. Let me choose some company, and if I click on the button, it says successfully inserted user ID 3 to company ID 4. I'm going to click on the OK button. If I try to do the same thing again, it's going to say, okay, this time user ID 3 is already assigned to company ID 4. So I'm doing some checks, and I'm also informing the user, which is a good way to inform the user. So then for that company, I can like assign somebody else. I can assign the same person to a different company. So these are the things that we are doing in this window. And let's look how we are doing that. So we need to first connect to our database. Then for this program, we actually are keeping a list of users and a list of companies. So these are going to be those lists, and they are initially empty. I need to put the values, but for the values I need to execute some SQL code and retrieve the values from there. So if you remember, this using this cursor cur.execute function can be used to execute any SQL query, and in this case I'm selecting ID, name and surname from the user table, and this is going to, since this is a select query, this is going to return a bunch of results, and to iterate over those list of results I can use a for loop. So for row in the result set that I get here, what I'm doing, I'm appending these to the user list. So users is a list, and I'm going to append this information to the user list as a tuple. So this is actually like a tuple. And row 0 is ID, row 1 is name, and row 2 is the surname. So you can use such things to apply some styling, but in here I can also write row, right? So let me show what happens if I just directly write row there. It is exactly the same. So that's written like that to show you that you can access these individual columns separately. Maybe you can change the ordering of things. For example, maybe I need the company name first, etc. I can play with the indexes. Maybe I don't need to append everything to the companies list. So let me go back. Maybe sometimes I could choose to append the IDs to a different list and names and surnames to a different list, for example. In such cases, this might be more meaningful, but in here I can just send the row as well and append them to the list. So then we create the layout. So in our layout we have a list of users and a list of companies. We decided to use a combo here because at a time we need to choose one of them. With the list box, the difference is we are displaying the whole thing always, right? So if you ask when to use a combo, when to use a list box, you can use either of them at any of the places. They are like kind of equivalent, but the difference is with the combo, you are not displaying the whole list constantly. Like you display the list whenever you need that. So that's just one difference. If I convert them to a list box, so instead of a combo, I can also use a list box, right? That's possible. It's going to display everything at the same time. And because of that difference, so right now if I try to assign as a partner, it is going to give an error, because if it's a list box, then it returns a list. I need to get to the index 0 if I would like to get the string. But let's leave them as combo for now. So I'm passing the users list and the companies lists to the respective items. And I have different keys for these two combos. So one is chosen user, one is chosen company. Their sizes, again, this is the width. And the 7 here refers to how many items that I'm going to display whenever I click on the triangle. So for example, if it's a big number, if I click here, it's going to list more values. So let me revert it back. So this is our layout. We have another button called assign as partner. We create our window, and this is our main loop for the program. And the only event that we are going to look at is whenever we click on assign as a partner button. And in this button, what we need to do, so let's actually first talk about that. So we have a bunch of users. I chose a user. We have a bunch of companies. I choose a company. And to assign a user to an existing company, what we need to do, we need to insert some information to the partner of table. If you remember, we had a partner of table to relate a user to a company. And we are doing that through the user ID and also through the company ID. I need to get the user ID and I need to get the company ID if I would like to relate these two entities. So in this case, for example, for the Brandon, I need to get 3. And for the company, I need to get the ID. So for user line and company line, I'm getting the whole data. So let me actually in here print what they look like. So user line, print also the company line. So they are called line because in here in our combo we actually have the whole line, right? They are actually a list of items or a tuple, but it is not just the ID, it is multiple things. So if I print the output, this is our output. For the user we have 3 values, for the company we have 2 values, but I need to get the IDs, right? So let me go back to the code. So I'm saying line because it has the whole thing, it's the tuple. So let's get rid of the printing area. And both of them should be chosen if they are equal to the empty string. So if the user line is empty string, I'm going to say, please choose a user. Let's do that. If it is empty, if I did not choose a user, if I try to assign, then it is going to give a message. It says, please choose a user. I need to choose a user. Then if I try to assign, this time it is going to say, please choose a company. So these two pop-up messages are doing that. If the user line or the company line is empty, we are displaying that message. We can directly get the values here as well, so that they are equivalent. But since I'm going to get some other values from the user line and company line, we use them as variables. If both of them are not empty, so if part, elif part, and the last else part is when the user line and company line is not empty, both are selected, we need to retrieve the IDs. So the IDs are in index 0. So for the user ID, I get it from user line index 0. For company ID, I get it from company line index 0. Then I have the IDs and I would like to insert this to the table. But first, I would like to check whether it already exists or not. Because if I try to insert it directly, if it already exists, it is going to give us an error about the primary key, right? The primary key should be unique. It is going to say that unique constraint failed. The combination of the user ID and the company ID should be unique, but you are trying to insert some value that is going to conflict with this constraint. So because of that, it is going to give us an error on the database side. And we don't want to get the error on the database side because our program is going to crash. Using the Python code, we would like to first check whether it is going to give us an error or not. So we should first check if this combination of the user ID and company ID already exists or not. So with our cursor to the database, we are going to execute some SQL code, and that SQL code is going to actually get two parameters. So if you remember, with this execute function, we have two options. We can give a string, and it is going to run that SQL code. And the second option, the first parameter is a string with some question marks in it. And those question marks will be replaced by the tuple that we give as the second parameter. So in my SQL code, I have two question marks, and the second parameter is a tuple. And each of the question marks will be replaced in order with these values that I give. So that's a way to pass parameters to our SQL code. You can also try to append strings, etc. But this is an easier way because when you are trying to append strings, there are cases when you need to be careful about the special symbols, those single quotations, double quotations, etc. Using the execute function with the second parameter is very easy because you just give the first parameter your SQL query with question marks in it, and the second parameter is a tuple that's going to replace those question marks in order. So in here we are trying to select everything, project everything from the partner of table. But for these two conditions, where user ID is equal to the question mark, it will be replaced by our user ID, the chosen user ID. And at the same time, we want the company ID to be equal to this second question mark, which is going to be replaced by the company ID, which is the company ID that we retrieve from user. So we previously today used a loop to go through the result set, but there is also the other option to use the fetch1 function. With the fetch1 function, we just retrieve one line from our result set. And in this case, actually, we expect if this user and company ID combination exists, it will appear only once. Because of that, I try to only fetch one line of data. I can also use a loop, and for the loop, if I get at least one element, then I can say, okay, this user is already assigned to that company, etc. But in here, we follow this style. So within the row parameter, if it is none, this means we can insert this user and company combination. This user is not a partner of that company currently. If the row is not none, this means that from this SQL query, we retrieve just one item. And that means that this user is already a partner of that company. We cannot try to insert it again. So on the else part, we cannot insert it. We are writing, okay, user ID, this is the user ID that you are going to insert. This is the company that you are going to insert. And this is already in our database, so we cannot insert it. This is the message that we write. But if we are able to insert it, we are going to execute some other query. And that query is, this time, an insertion query. The difference between select and other types of queries, with select queries, it returns a list of results, right? We can use a loop, or we can fetch results from the select queries. But for other type of queries, for example, insert, update, delete, create queries, these are not returning any values. So we are going to just execute this query and it will insert into the partner of table. So we are again using the same style. The first parameter is our SQL code, our SQL query. It contains some question marks, and those question marks will be replaced by the second parameter, which is a tuple. And again, let me remind, if there was just one question mark, you still need to give them as a tuple. And a tuple means that they are within the brackets, parentheses, and there should be this comma sign, meaning that this is a tuple. Otherwise, if you just write user ID directly, it is not a tuple, so it will cause problems. So that was something we covered in the previous lab. But if we are passing more than one thing, it is more obvious that it should be a tuple. Then we insert the data, but still we should give some information to the user. If we are not showing a pop-up message, the user is not sure what happened, right? We are showing the message saying, okay, you successfully inserted, and these are the values, this is the user ID, this is the company ID, so no problems, etc. So let me run it one more time. So these are the error messages when the fields are empty. It says choose a user, choose a company, and whenever we choose both of them, then we can assign as a partner. It says successfully inserted, but if we are trying to assign when it already exists in the database, then we are showing the error message. And in here, for the combo, if one of the items appear with a space character in it, within the combo it displays these curly brackets. So that's not an error, that's just the way it operates. If there is the space character within the text, it displays them in a curly bracket. One more thing from the previous lab actually, whenever we are doing something on the database, if we are doing insertion, deletion, or updates, for the changes to be saved, you need to commit the changes, right? In here, we are not committing our changes. So that's one thing to be careful. Maybe I'm testing the database, I'm testing the functionality. Because of that, I may omit the commit part. But commit can happen in two different areas. So in here, I can say for my connection, commit the changes, save the changes. This was similar in SQL Studio as well. Some other part to commit the changes, so it should happen before we close. Some other part can be after successful operations. So I can commit after a successful operation as well. So I inserted the user, I gave the success message, then I can commit. If my program crashes, for example, these successful operations will not be gone. Otherwise, if I'm committing at the last stage, after I close the window, before I close the cursor, the connection, then I need to be careful, right? Otherwise, let's say I insert lots of users, I change some data, and my program crashes. If that thing that I did was important, then I should commit after each successful operation. So that's one thing to be careful about. So in most cases, before insertion, we should make some checks. So these are a list of things that we might want to check. So the attributes that we are giving, they should be in correct type, meaning that, for example, for a number, we should give a number. For a text, we should give a text. Sometimes we need to check ranges. For example, for the grade, it should not be larger than 100, for example. Not null attributes should be filled. For example, we are trying to create a user. Whether the name is required or not, it is something we decide. And if it is required, then in the user interface as well, if the user omits entering something into the name field, you can give an error message and say, okay, you have to write the name. primary keys should not conflict. So in this example, we checked whether that partner of entry is there or not. And we need to satisfy the foreign key constraints, right? But if the user is choosing from the existing list of elements, then this is already satisfied. So in this example, if I'm allowed to write the user ID directly and the company ID directly, then it is not guaranteed that there is this user and that company. But if I'm choosing among the existing items, then we can say that, okay, the foreign key constraints are satisfied because Paula is an existing user and I'm choosing from this existing list of users. So if you are allowing the user to choose among an existing item list, then there will be no problems for the foreign key constraints. So let's go for this next example. So let me actually run it first. So this is for inserting a new user. And if I try to insert a new user directly, it is going to say name cannot be empty. So I need to fill these fields, right? It says surname cannot be empty. So let's write the surname. I need to write the credits. I need to choose a status, not just any status. I'm going to choose among the existing items for the status. I need to enter the date of birth. For this, we are going to use some special button. It's the calendar button. So if I click on the choose date button, I'm able to choose a date from here. So I can, for example, shuffle through existing months, etc. And whenever I click, it is going to be in the correct format. So I can also choose some city, for example, here. And whenever I click on Izmir, it says successfully inserted this user with this new ID. And if you realize, I'm not asking for the ID. Whenever I try to insert a new user, I'm finding the next available ID. For example, it said 21, 22, 23. So the IDs are incrementing whenever I add a new user. So this cell is actually fairly simple. So we have the status options for the status of the user. In our layout, we have a bunch of texts, and for each text, we have some inputs. For the status, we are using the combo, and we are just passing the status options to there. And for any item that we expect inputs from, we need to write their key as well. So for example, in here, for the status, the key is called status. For the credit, the key is called credit. If they are called the same thing, it will be easier for us. And then for choosing the dates, so the dates are kind of hard to type, right? It is better to choose the date from a bunch of dates, available dates. For that, we are using a special button called the calendar button. So sg.calendar button is going to create a calendar button for us. So the name of the button, the function name is calendar button. This choose date is the text that appears on the button. So we can write anything there. That's, for example, the choose date is good enough. And we need to also write the formatting. So in the previous lab as well, we talked about how to format date. And for SQLite, we need to give the date as year dash month dash day. And because of that, this is the format that we are going to use. So in your projects, you can just directly copy this code and use it for the date or the calendar button. It is going to, whenever you choose a date, it is going to replace the value of the item that it appears just before this calendar button. So on this line, I'm saying, okay, date of birth, it is the text. This is the information for the user. But then I have this input area. The user can directly type in this input, but the user can also click on the calendar button. And whenever user chooses some date from this button or this pop-up window, it is going to be replacing this input area. So let me run it. So date of birth, this is the input, this is the button. I'm able to type something to here. But if I click on chose date and if I choose a date, it is going to replace the value that I written into this input. So that's just one special button that we can use. And for city, we have again a simple input and we have the insert button. So we create this window with our layouts. And in our main loop, we catch the insert event and we get the parameters. So how you get the parameters is actually not that important. So in here, we decided that we can keep them as a tuple, right? Because we are actually in feature, if we are going to execute the insert query, we require a tuple. So we are going to insert into the user table these values. Those question marks will be replaced by the corresponding values in our tuple. Because of that, we form a tuple here, but then we need to check some constraints. For example, for this name, it should not be empty. We are checking whether it is empty or not. So for most of our parameters, we are checking whether they are empty or not. And for some of them, for example, for the credit, we are checking whether it is numeric or not. So let me run it. We are checking them in order. Because of that, I will write in order. But for the credit, if I write non-numeric values, it is going to say credit should be numeric. Then this is the error message that we get. The user has to fix the mistake. If it is not empty, so in here, we first check whether it is empty or not. Then if it is not empty, then we are checking if it is numeric or not, because the credit should be numeric. So these are all our checks. And then we find out the next available user ID. Because we did not ask for the user ID, we are going to choose it automatically. Because of that, we are going to retrieve some information from the database. We are saying, okay, select the maximum ID from the user table. Let's say the last user has ID 20. We get that result. So this is the result as a tuple, as a row. It can contain multiple columns, multiple attributes. And in the zero index 0, we have the first column, which is a number. Since this is already a number, I don't need to convert it to an integer, etc. So when I execute some query that returns a number, I can directly use it as a number. It's not a string here. I can add 1 to it. If I'm returning a text, a string, and if I would like to treat it as a number, I need to convert it into a number. So that's one difference. So if the value that I project is already a number, then I can directly use it as a number in Python. So I call this new ID. And remember, in our tuple for the parameters, the ID is missing. The ID should be the first parameter, the first index value here. And because of that, I would like to have another tuple with only the new ID in it. And this is some other tuple. I concatenate these two tuples. And now the new parameters is going to be the concatenation of these two things. And then I will execute my insert query. And if I came to this part, I know that none of the required fields are empty. They are all they all contain some correct values. For example, the credits contains the numeric value, etc. I'm able to insert this user. I execute this insert query, and then I give a success message to the user saying, okay, you inserted this user, this is the username, and this is the ID of that user. Because I generated the ID automatically, I kind of need to show the ID of that user. And in here we are committing our changes actually. Then we close the connection and the window. So in here we have an example that updates an existing item. So for a chosen user, we would like to list the partner companies. So in here we have our user list, I'm going to choose one of these users. So these three are the last users that we add. But for example, if I choose the user number 1, if I click on list partner companies, this is going to list the partner companies of that user within the same window without closing this window. So let me choose some other user, click on list partner companies. I'm updating an existing list box here. So let's look at the different or more important parts of this code. So I again establish the connection to the database. I have a users list. I execute a projection query to get the users. I append the users here. So this is very much similar to the last cell. I have a list for companies, but I'm actually not filling this company list initially. What I'm doing, I'm just creating my layout. And for the list box for the companies, this is giving the empty companies list. It is the empty list. That list box is going to contain nothing, but I set its size, etc. But for the user list, it is a combo actually. The key is user, and I'm giving the list of users there initially. So if I run it, you will see that initially there are users, but initially there are no companies. Then in my program loop, if I click on list partner companies, I'm retrieving the user ID. So from the values of the user, for a user, if you look, I have three values, right? The ID, name, and the surname of the user. And because of that, to get the ID of the user, I need to go to the index 0. So from that index 0, then I have the ID of the user, and I would like to fill the company list. So if it was filled already, I would like to set it to empty list, because I will execute some query, and in that query, what I'm doing, I'm getting or projecting the CID, company name, and monthly payment from the partner of and company tables. I have two tables. I need to make the join operation as well. So my join conditions, CID should be equal to the company ID, and another join condition, the user ID, should be equal to this question mark, and that question mark is replaced by the user ID. So for this user ID that I'm giving, join them for the partner of and company tables, make the join operation, and list the company names, companies, IDs, and also the monthly payments. So this is going to append the results to the companies list. And to update the existing item, so let me just omit this line and show what happens. So I'm choosing the user, and the existing window does not change, the list box does not change. The change happens on this line. In the current window, I'm retrieving some element, and this element is called company. So if you remember, while creating the layouts, we give a key to our list box. So for this list box, we gave the key company, and because of that, whenever I want to retrieve that list box, I can call the element function in the window with the key of that list box. Then I need to call the update function. So the update function can be used for updating any of the parameters of the list box, and one of them was values. So for this, we update the values and set it to the companies list, which we fill using our companies. So whenever I click on the list partner companies, I first initiate the list to empty list, and then I append the new rows, and then I append the existing element. For example, if I were to omit this set to empty list part, then whenever I choose some user and click on list partner companies, they will add up. So because of that, I need to first set it to the empty list. So whenever I choose something, it is adding up. So that's not something I want. I want to first set it to empty list, then I retrieve the companies of that user and I only show that user's companies. And to update some existing item, this is the line that I'm using. So window.element function, it requires the key. So because of that, if I would like to modify something, I need to have a key for that. So in our layout, actually for any of these elements, I can assign keys. For example, I can assign a key for the text part as well. So let me assign this key called AAA, for example. Then I can retrieve that through the key. So in here, for example, window.elements.company, I can update something related to that. So in here, if I write AAA, I can call the update function for that. But for text, it is called value, not values. So that's one difference. For listbox and combo, it is called values when you are updating, but for the other elements, it is called value if it is just one value. So let me write something for the value. So whenever I click on, so currently it says user here, whenever I click on, oh, okay, I needed to choose some existing user. So that's one thing that we are not checking in this code. So whether the user chose some value or not, some user or not. And because we omit that in this part, whenever I choose nothing as well, it is going to try to get the zero index of nothing, which causes the problem. So I need to, in here, interrupt the kernel, close this existing window. Either I need to like check whether you wrote something or not there, or I should choose the user. So let me restart it and choose a user here. In here it says user. Whenever I click on that button, it updates the value of an existing item. So to update the value of an existing item, what I need to do, I need to call the element function with the key of that item, and because of that, that item has to have a key, and most of the time we write a key for the inputs for listbox and combo, but for a text as well, for a button as well, we can assign a unique key within that layout. And this is going to be like our couple of last examples here. So let me just quickly go through them. So this is a send credit example. In here we are able to choose a from and to user. So this is exactly the same thing, right? We displayed all users twice this time to choose a from user and a to user. Whenever I try to send, I need to also enter the amount. And this time the amount should be less than Paula's credits. For example, in here, if I type 1,000, it doesn't make sense because Paula has 520 credits. It is going to say insufficient credits. If I try to here, for example, write negative values, sending negative means that I'm actually receiving money from Brandon. It is actually not possible. Amount should be positive. It's another message that we display. But if we write the correct amounts, for example, Paula has 520, Brandon has 380. If I click on send, it says successfully sent 50 from Paula to Brandon. If I click on OK, we reset the window. And if we check, Paula has more money now. Paula has less money now, and Brandon has more money now. So let me actually show the important areas. Again, we have a list of users, and in this user list, we are going to like send them the same users list to the different combos. So we have two combos. One is from user, one is to user, and they both contain the same list of users. And one other functionality here, if I choose Paula and Paula, then it doesn't make much sense to send money to self. It displays cannot send to self message. And in here, whenever I click on the send button, I get the information for the from user and to users, and I check whether they are empty or not here. They should be both non-empty. I look whether the amount is empty or not. it should be not empty as well. Then I get the IDs of these users. They are in index 0. If the IDs are the same, I'm going to say you cannot send the money to yourself. Then I'm going to convert the amount into an integer because the input receives as a string. So let me run it again. From the database, if it's a number, we get a number. But for all these input is a string. If I would like to operate it as a number, I need to convert it to a number. And to do that, one option is to convert it into an integer. So I'm using the int function for this amount that I get. And I'm putting it the variable called amount. That should be less than, it should be positive. If it is less than or equal to 0, I'm saying amount should be positive because sending 0 is also doing nothing. So if it is positive, we are in this else part. Then one more thing I need to check. I need to check whether I have sufficient credits or not. So I'm getting the credit from the user table for the ID of the from user ID. So the from user ID, the first one I choose, I get the ID of that user to find the credit amount of that user. I fetch one result, and from the index 0, column 0, which contains the credits, I get the number, credit of from user. It should be less than amount. So if maybe in here we can also say less than and equal to, because if I have 100 credits, I should be able to send 100 credits. So sorry, actually, this is like for the error message. If it is less than the amount, the credits is less than the amount, I'm going to say insufficient credits. If it is equal, that's okay. This is our error message. On the else part, then we can send the written amount. Then we are going to execute two queries, right? One is going to, for the from user, it is going to reduce the amount of credits. So for this first user, decrease the credit amount by this first question mark, which is amount. And the ID of this user is going to be contained in this variable called from underscore user ID. And for that other user, this time I would like to increase the credit. So credit equals credit plus question mark, and that question mark is going to be replaced by the amount. So these two are the same amount. So in bank accounts, for example, if I'm reducing some amount from some account, I should be increasing the same amount. So I'm using that same amount. But these are for two different users. So one is from user. In there, I'm decreasing. One is the to user, the second user. In there, I'm increasing the amount. And at the end, I display the message. I'm saying, okay, successfully send this amount from this user to that user. And then I need to update the lists because the credit of the users has changed. So these are actually doing what I initially did. Remember, initially I have a list of users. I get information from the database. And while creating the layout, I'm sending those lists to the combo elements. Then in here, what I'm doing for updates is again the same. I have the empty users list. I retrieve information from the database, but this time I need to update the existing combos. So instead of creating a new layout, I update the element called from user. So the values will be this same user list. And for that other one, it is actually again going to contain the same users list. And then I also clear the amount. Clearing the amount means that I update the value of it to empty string. So whenever I send the money, for example, I send from Paula to somebody else, Brandon, some amount. Whenever I send, I'm going to update this value to nothing as well. And since these two lists or combos are refreshed, they are going to also have none or no values as well. So in this okay, we have this one. In this one, instead of choosing a user, we are going to log in as a user. As one of the users, we would like to actually log into the system. And for login, we can have some password combinations, etc. We ask for some information from the user, and the user should type something to say that, okay, I am that user, and that information should be probably unique to that user. Otherwise, we would have some problem, and it should be like special information like password. But in this database, we decided that, okay, let's just go with the ID and the name. Let's say that that is going to be enough, and let's say that new user Ali has ID 21 and the name is going to be Ali, and whenever I log in it says welcome Ali, and in here I see my current credit amount. I can choose someone to send money to. For example, to Paula I can send 10 credits. So whenever I click on here, my current credit is updated. I can choose some other user, for example to William. I can send 30. My amount is decreasing, and if I check, those other people's amount is increasing, and at the end I can click on the logout button, and if I choose no users, it is going to give us error messages. If I enter too high amount, it's going to still say insufficient credits, etc. In here, the only difference is that instead of choosing the from user, we are logging as we are going through a login step to log in as one of the users. And to do that, actually, it's fairly simple. It is the same thing that we did before. We have our first window, and in that window, if I click on the login, what I'm doing, I retrieve the user ID and the username, and I'm checking whether these combination, this user ID and username combination exists as a user in my database. But for that check, these two of them should be filled, right? The user ID should be non-empty, username should be non-empty, otherwise I'm saying, okay, these are missing. Then I need to execute a query. So from the user table, I need to find a user with the matching ID and name. So for this user ID and username. Then if I'm able to retrieve something, so I try to fetch one item. If it is none, it means no such user. So let me quickly show that. For random combination, it says no such user. I'm not able to continue. Otherwise, if there is a user with the given information, I'm keeping the login ID, because once I log in, I don't need to actually remind the program who am I, right? I'm going to identify myself at the beginning, and then I expect the program to keep the information about me. And that information is actually the primary key of the user. So because of that, I'm keeping the login ID here. So we are saying, okay, welcome username, because we already got the username from user. We close that current window. We have the list of users. In here as well, we have some slight difference. We are saying that, okay, to send the money to another user, I'm displaying a bunch of users. And among those users, I do not want to display myself. So I'm only retrieving the users whose ID is not equal to my ID. So this is doing that. Otherwise, it is fairly similar to our last example. And in here, we are retrieving the credits for the user that we log in as. So we logged in as Ali, for example. I need to know the credit now or credit amount of Ali, because we are displaying it. So if I run it for 21 and Ali, I need to write the current credit of Ali here. So because of that, I retrieve the credit for Ali. I put that information in my new layout in that window. And whenever I want to send, checking the amount is the same with the last example. So it should be positive, etc. Whenever I'm trying to send, I'm again checking whether it is less than the amount that I have currently. Otherwise, I will say insufficient credits. And then if everything is fine, then I use to update queries. One is to decrease my credits, one is to increase the other person's credits. And then I need to update the lists, right? Because in the list, I'm also showing the credit of other people, which is like in real life examples, not the case, but I'm able to see other people's money. Because of that, I'm updating those lists. I clear the amount. So this is again something that we did. But one other thing, I would like to also update my current credits. And for that, I'm using the exactly same code, but instead of passing it to my layout, I'm going to call the update function for the correct elements. And this is for logout. Whenever we click on the logout button, it does something different than exiting the program. So if I log in as Ali, I can close the program, or I can log out. If I log out, I'm back to the beginning. I'm able to log in as some other user. So in here, it is exactly the same thing. So the code is the same, or the functionality is the same, but we are using functions, because if we use functions, we can have like better work among in our group, like we can share the work easily, etc. In here, exactly same thing. We have functions to create the login window, to create the send window. Whenever we click on the login button, this function is what we are doing. So whenever we click on the send button, this function is what we are doing. And in our program, we are keeping the login ID, because whenever we log in as some user, we would like to keep this information. So we create the initial window, and we are reading the events and values. We check the events. Based on the event, we call functions. So these functions, for example, whenever I click on the login button, I can directly write that the code for that function to there directly. But if you define the functions separately, then it will be easier to like design them. So for example, in here, whenever I click on the login button, I'm going to call the button login function. And while sharing work among the group, I can say, okay, you are going to write the definition for this button. And in this button, I expect you to do this and this. I expect you to get the values. Okay, for that values, you are going to check this and that. So that will be easier for you. And within those functions, we have some global variables sometimes. So if you remember, within this function's scope, the variables, if they are the first time we are defining those variables, they will not refer to the variables outside. So for example, if I have a window here, within the function, if I'm just using the window, if I'm just using the value, then it's going to refer to the variable that's outside. But if I'm assigning it to some other value, so in here, actually, to change the window, we need to assign the window variable to some value. And if I'm assigning it to some other value, by default, it is going to be a local variable. If I would like to say that, okay, modify this variable, but it is the global one, I need to explicitly say that it is the global one. So that's one difference. When you introduce functions, you need to be careful about the scope of the variables, etc. If you would like to operate on the global variable, you need to say that it is the global variable. Otherwise, for example, for some other variables, they are only used locally. And if you are just getting the value, by default, it is going to reach that global variable. But if you are setting it to some other value, then it is going to be by default the local variable. If it should be the global one, you need to explicitly say that it is the global one. So while creating the send window, we don't require any global variables. So while creating the windows, actually we were returning that window, and then we were switching, right? We close the current window, we get the definition for the new window using the function. And if we would like to put the functionality of a button into a function as well, we need to be careful about the values, so the scope of the variables. So one thing, this values, actually I did not need to write global values without writing it. It is going to be the global one here, actually within that loop. So within that loop we have this variable. Whenever we go into that function, for example button send, we still have the definition for the values. And since inside my function I'm only using it in my function, there is nothing like that. So I'm not assigning values to something. Because of that, I don't need to say that it is the global one. It will use the global one if it already exists. So the global thing, the global deal is only when you need to assign that value to something else. And for switching the windows, if you remember, we need to make assignments. Because of that, we need to use that. You might also sometimes it will be useful if you pass the parameters. Maybe for the login ID, instead of using the global variable, it could be a return value as well. But then you need to be careful when you are catching the events. So it is like up to you how you design it. This is just like one example. And for your projects, it is not that important how you design. So we are going to look at the functionality. So your code could be messed up, so that's okay. You don't need to use functions for creating windows for the functionality of the buttons. But it is better if you use them because it helps your sharing work. So for you only, it is going to be helpful. Otherwise, we are not going to give credit for the code. We just look at the functionality. You are going to actually do it in the demo. So otherwise, that's it. If you have any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, that's it for this lab. I actually recommend if on the website this code is there, it will be useful for the project's next stage. So yourself, you can go through these examples. In the next stage of the project, implementation stage 2, you are actually going to choose a scenario and you are going to implement it using Python with a graphical user interface. So you are going to both use Python and the database that you created. So you are going to use the libraries SQL-Lit3 and PySimple GUI. If you already know some other library for the user interface, you can also use that. But this is like the recommended one. And if you have any problems or questions about these libraries, we can answer. And otherwise, we don't know the other libraries, and you will be on your own in that case. But if you, for example, there are some other libraries to create the user interface, if your group is fine with that, if you know it in a good way, you can use those other libraries as well. That will be fine for us as long as it supports the things that we have seen today. So any questions or problems? Otherwise, that's it for today. See you later.